So hear the Word of God as it is recorded in the New Testament, reading from the Gospel of Matthew, from chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. When Jesus was born in the village of Bethlehem in Judea, Herod was king. During this time, some wise men from the east came to Jerusalem and said, "Where is the child born to be king of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." And then beginning with verse 7, Herod called in the wise men and asked them when they had first seen the star. He told them, "Go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, let me know. I want to go and worship him too." The wise men listened to what the king said and then left, and the star they had seen in the east went on ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. Later, when they were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they went back home by another road. And there ends our reading of the Gospel. Let me begin by saying that this is not going to be a heavy theological dissertation this morning. You've done that during the Sundays of Advent. And then the child came. And now the wise men are appearing. And it's time to do something other than theological reflection. To do some cogitating over the significance of light as it comes into our world. Especially when that light comes in times of darkness. It can mean different things for different people. For some, like the wise men, it's a time of anticipation when they want to go and filled with adoration and joy and wonder fall at the feet of a new king. For Herod, it's a time of fear, of suspicion, of guardedness. And so it goes. As many people as there are around, there are different ways to view the light that comes in darkness. Years ago, in the hometown where I grew up, the pastor, Reinhard van Dyke, had his own feelings about that light. He wished it would shine on the people and bring them out of their idleness and fill them with zeal. And he came in that Sunday after Christmas filled with a sense of the urgency of the light of God. And he stood in the pulpit and he preached to them. And he preached out of vitality and concern and deep and abiding hopes that the people would begin to wake up out of sleep and start becoming the lively people of God. Mr. Van Dyke came to that church from the Dutch Reformed Church, where it was the practice for the pastors to preach in swallowtail coats and striped trousers and spats. And he was the pastor of a church that was too poor to have a secretary, so he had the mimeograph ink under his fingernails and it worked into the pores of his skin. And he was embarrassed by that, so he always preached with his hands behind his back. And when he came down to the end of his sermon, he'd get so excited he would stretch out his hands and he would flip them, and the tail of his coat would flip out. And members of the congregation came to understand that when the tails of the coat flipped out, that was the time to listen carefully to what he had to say, because that's the point he wanted. And there was Mr. Van Dyke that Sunday morning with his fingers stiffening behind his coat, and he would say, "Look for the light, children. Look for the light. Be no more children of darkness, but look for the light. Follow the light. It will bring you into the glory of God's presence. And there were two people there that were deeply impressed by that. One was Willis Wilson, who was the son of Miles Wilson, who was the Dodge Plymouth dealer in Sussex. Willis had come home from World War II, went to work for his dad, and had been so anxious to introduce new practices of sales. And Miles continually put him off. And then Miles went to the doctor, and the doctor said, "You're under too much stress. You must take some time off." So that Thanksgiving, Miles informed his son that he was going south for the winter, and he left and went to Florida. And Willis immediately started instituting some of the practices that his dad had said no to, figuring if he got them in place before his father came home, all would be well. His father would see the advantages of the new business. And he contacted the Van Tassel family, who were father and son electricians, Big Bill and Little Bill Van Tassel. Big Bill was the father, but as the genes developed, and Little Bill ended up being 6 inches taller than his dad. But by that time, they were so into those names that they were still known as Big Bill and Little Bill. And Willis engaged them to do some work which would really renovate the whole business in his mind. The other person that was taken by the pastor's sermon was Jenny Marvin. Jenny Marvin always sat just where you're sitting, because that gave her the advantage of being able to keep an eye on the pastor's hands. And when those tails flickered out beyond the pulpit so she could see the waving of the tails, she listened carefully. Now, Jenny was a sweet, sweet lady, but a little thin in the head. She took everything the pastor said as absolutely, faithfully, without error. So when she heard about following the light and looking for the light, she took it to heart. And when worship was over that morning, she said, "Mr. Van Dyke, please be aware. I will look for the light, and when I see the light, I will follow." And with that, she left the sanctuary and went home. And Mr. Van Dyke said, "I wonder if I should have been a little more gentle. Jenny can get things mixed up." Well, Jenny went home, and as she usually did on the Sunday after church, she settled down in her kitchen to wait for the coffee to warm up and for the soup to get hot, and she fell asleep. She slept for 4 hours. It was 5 o'clock, and as you know, at 5 o'clock this time of year, it's dark. And she opened up her eyes, and she was startled because coming in her kitchen window, which faced east, was this wonderful light. She had never seen a light shining so brightly in her kitchen at this time of day, ever, forever, and ever, even in the summer. And she jumped up and she put on her coat and her boots, and she set out to see to see the light for herself. And she thought it's such a wonderful thing. She'd stop on the way and invite some people to go along with her. So she stopped to see Mrs. Willis. And Mrs. Willis was bored and wondering how to spend her time. And Mrs. Willis put on her coat. Then they went across the street. They got the Dunning sisters. And then they went down the street. And they got Mrs. Potter. And now the half a dozen of them set off down the street. They had to go down Unionville Avenue to the highway and then turn and come on back, because that was the only way to get down to where that light was shining. And as they came around the corner and they could see the light was emerging, what they noticed down just at the bend in the road were 3 men standing at the foot of the light looking up. And Jenny Marvin said, "That has to be the Magi. We got here just in time to meet the wise men. How wonderful." Well, as they got closer, they found out it wasn't the wise men. It was Willis Wilson and the Van Tassels. And they were standing there and they were looking up at a sign the Van Tassels had just gotten installed that said, "Wilson Motors, the home of Plymouth, Dodge, Chrysler." And it flashed this beautiful gold light that spread out across the heavens and down. Well, the women chuckled at that. They thought that was such a wonderful joke on them, that they'd come down there to see the wonderful light of God, and what they found was a new sign advertising an automotive agency. But they decided that as long as they were out, they might as well make some use of their time, and they walked across town to Mr. Van Dyke's house, and they stood outside the parsonage, and they sang Christmas carols. "Brightest and best of the sons of the morning," they sang. They sang, "Hark the herald angels sing." They sang, "Oh, come, all ye faithful." And Van Dykes came out on the front porch and saw these silly old ladies standing there singing. And they invited them in, and they offered them coffee and hot chocolate and tea and Christmas cookies. And they sat around, and Jenny Marvin told the Van Dykes about seeing the light. And the women told the Van Dykes about finding out that the Magi were really Willis Wilson and the Van Tassels. And Mr. Van Dyke got more and more quiet, but inside the quietness was a deep disturbance. When the women finally got up and went home, Mr. Van Dyke said to his wife, "That's it. This is the last time that I'm going to set myself up to have those silly old fools come in and tell me things like that. I'm close enough to retirement. I'm going to retire. I'm going to sit down now and write the letter before I change my mind, and I'm going to be out of here within a month." His wife had heard this kind of groaning before and said, "That's nice, dear. I'm going to bed." Mr. Van Dyke went into his office and sat down, wrote a letter to the session. "Dear session, be it known that 30 days from this date, I shall be retiring as your pastor. Please do not try to dissuade me. Sincerely, Reinhard Van Dyke." And he put it in an envelope. And he started down the street to the mailbox so that he could drop it in the mail before he had a chance to change his mind. He got to the mailbox and opened the slot, and he was just about ready to drop the letter in the slot when the sky went dark. Because the Van Tassels had put a timer on that light. And it so startled Mr. Van Dyke that he stepped back. And as he stepped back, he looked up. And lo and behold, right over his head, emerging from the light now out of the darkness, came the glow of a star. And it seemed to Mr. Van Dyke to get larger and larger. And he took another couple steps and he sat down on a wall on the other side of the sidewalk and just looked at that star for a few minutes. They began to realize how silly we human beings are to shed our light into the world in such a fashion that we lose the sight of the light of God that comes to us as a promise and a blessing. He just shook his head in wonder at that beautiful, beautiful star that was shining down on him. And then he did the only thing that a sensible Presbyterian could do. He tore up his letter of resignation, put it in his pocket, and he went home. And he went upstairs, and as he was crawling into bed, his wife said, "Happy New Year's, dear." He said, "Happy New Year's, my love. May the next year bring us more blessings than this one has at the end of it."